Hello AOS fans, Robin here, back in front of the camera again today. Pete and I have noticed that us sitting in front of the camera and talking to you guys seems to be playing quite well out there in the stall, so we thought we'd try and up our content of those. I know people love our battle reports, but strangely, or maybe not strangely, more people seem to be watching stuff we do about Fantasy Flight, or Pete did a video recently about the loot box, and they've got more hits than our battle reports. So although we love doing the battle reports, and obviously we'll keep doing those, we're going to try and do more me or Pete in front of the camera talking probably rubbish. And tonight I want to kind of get away from Underworlds and get away from things we generally talk about. I want to talk a little bit about lore and canon and the evolution of that. I know there's a lot of controversy about that in the game, particularly around 40k, and I've had a couple of experiences recently which have really made me think about that and try and reappraise it and think about what it means and whether the lore and the canon should change or whether it should be sort of fixed in aspect. I think probably people who know me know my feelings on this, so if you do think everything should be kept the same and new influences shouldn't be allowed to filter in, then you probably want to stop watching now. So first of all, I suppose, what is lore and what is canon? Canon is meant to be the kind of basis on which something is built, I guess. So we have canonical English literature works like Shakespeare and Chaucer, and probably people like Jane Austen and Charles Dickens and things like that. And then in science fiction we definitely have them, so we're looking at Heinlein, Asimov, Ray Bradbury, people like that. And in 40k universe, well, I don't actually know very much about the lore of the 40k universe, but I guess canon and lore are more defined by the terms of how Space Marines came about and how the Imperium evolved in the stories, or what it came about, how it's set, because the Imperium is a very static and set place, and people don't like it if you mess with that. What lore really is a body of traditions and knowledge on a subject, and that is what the dictionary definition of lore is. I think it tends to get swapped with just with stories. It's kind of like old stories or long stories, and the weird thing is that body of tradition and particularly the stories, they change. If you think of fairy tales, there are millions of different versions of different fairy tales retold by different people and told by different people. But of course nowadays this storytelling is sort of codified in capitalism. So Games Workshop have codified their stories because they want to sell them and make money out of them, and Disney have codified the fairy tales because they sell them and make money out of them. So there's an interesting sort of stories evolve, but now they have to evolve in a certain direction because people want to make money out of that evolution. Now of course comic books, again, we'll come back onto this in a bit more detail, but they've evolved, and people say, oh well, they're losing money hand over fist, but that really isn't true, I don't think, because there may be certain strands haven't worked, but actually comic book movies are bigger than they've ever been, and I imagine that comic book readership is probably bigger and better than it has ever been. But all of these things are built, I suppose, on canon. So this part of this reason for doing this video was from, I read a piece by John Scalzi called something like, oh no, we're not going to talk about canon again, are we? And he was talking about the science fiction canon, and this is in response to slightly shambolic events of Worldcon, which I don't know very much about. It was a big science fiction writers convention. It's been sort of had controversy over it for years because it's got a strong old guard of white men, basically, who kind of protect what they've had for a very long time as the kind of sort of industry stalwarts, and they're protecting their position. And I think there were lots of, or at least an award which celebrated some great venerated man from old, and then people were sort of talking about the relevance of science fiction canon, because the thing with science fiction is it's an incredibly progressive genre. So the idea is that it should be preserved in some ways is a bit nonsense, because actually it's people writing science fiction now at the cutting edge, because science fiction is normally satirical and political, and it reflects the society in which we live in now. So it's perhaps not so relevant for people like Heinlein and Bradbury. The stuff they wrote was incredibly relevant at the time and important, and Le Guin as well, and all very important stuff. But of course now the world has moved on, science fiction is built upon the stuff that they've written, but the world has changed and sensibilities have changed since they wrote, and so perhaps their stuff is less relevant. Obviously not always. There are some works that do obviously always shine out across the ages. Shakespeare being a classic still seems to talk to people, but of course even Shakespeare gets reinterpretations, and they can be modern and removed from the kind of Elizabethan setting that they perhaps originally set in, and now we've got Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet. That's a very famous Ian McKellen, Richard III, which is set in Nazi Germany. So even Shakespeare can be updated and reinterpreted, and indeed is, and people do moan about that too. One of the things I took out of John Scalzi's comments was that new readers don't really care what canon is; they just want a good story. And although current writers might have been influenced by that canon, Scalzi talks about some of his influences, and actually I think he talks about Heinlein being one, but not so many of the others. He says many of his other influences people like William Goldman. So they're not necessarily science fiction writers, but the people who are writing today, they might have been influenced by this science fiction canon. But the people who are reading it are one step further removed, so they probably haven't necessarily read it. They're people much younger than me, sort of 30, 40 years younger than me, maybe not 40 years, but 30 years younger than me, and they probably don't care about the books that were written 50 years ago, but they might be more interested. They're more interested in the books that are written now, and maybe 20, 30 years ago. But so the canon is forever shifting and becoming less relevant, especially in a field like science fiction. And where does this leave us? If we look at Marvel, the original comic books, and DC, indeed, were basically written. I believe, I'm not a comic lore historian by any stretch of the imagination, but I believe a lot of the original comic book artists and writers were Jewish immigrants into the US, escaping Nazi Germany, and they wrote stories about superheroes taking on the Nazis. So they were incredibly relevant to the times of the day, which is kind of similar to Warhammer 40,000, although perhaps a little less serious. Warhammer 40,000 was Jervis Johnson and that lot's kind of response to Thatcherite Britain at the time. So some might say it was fascism in a form, but it obviously was very different to Nazi Germany. But the stories were rooted in the politics and the history of the time, and of course the stories have evolved during that period because they've evolved with history. So the stories are always being told more or less concurrently. So the stories that are told evolve with the time. So the Black Panther thread became extremely important in the 1960s and things like that. And obviously there have been people who've moaned about it, but there have been far more female representation because female representation and equality is more prevalent, relevant, important than it's ever been. I mean, I wouldn't say it's more important than it's ever been. It's always been important, but it's up there. People are talking about it, and obviously that is a good thing. So that means the stories reflect that. But the difference with the comic book universe and the Warhammer 40,000 universe is that they have the power to evolve in the comic books because the stories are being retold all the time, and there's all sorts of reinvention. The Imperium has kind of been static since it's been invented. But do new readers, do they care about that? I know that there's a wealth of books out there about the Imperium, but some of those now were written 30 years ago or 20 years ago, and are they relevant anymore to modern readers, and should they be? I don't know how many Horus Heresy books there are now, but should anybody be expected to necessarily read them all? They just want to kind of dive in. I remember being told, I wrote a piece a long time ago about diversity in 40k, and I got really all sorts of horrible comments made. And a lot of people was, well, you haven't read, it does say this, you haven't read in this book such and such. Well, should I shouldn't have to go off and read that to find the diversity. I shouldn't have to read 13 books or one particular book out of 50 books to find this particular diverse thread. That's not what it's about. It needs to be reflected in the fiction that's coming out now, that's that's relevant, that people want to read, and you can see that in the books that are coming out from GW now, and it should be reflected in people's games and miniatures, because at the end of the day that lore was created by people playing games and inventing the stories for their miniatures. So this is coming back in Indomitus with the Crusade rules. People are creating new stories for their models, and people should be able to do whatever they want without interference from people saying, well, I'm sorry, that doesn't adhere to loads of other stuff that's gone before, because that is just made up stories. Okay, yes, it's been codified, packaged up and sold to you, but it doesn't mean that it's fixed, because nothing is fixed, because everything is evolving all the time, and it should be, because new readers are coming in, new people are discovering the hobby, and they want to be able to create their own stories, because that's what it's about. I mean, this is kind of an offshoot of role-playing, which is about creating stories. It's about creating stories, it's about creating your own stories and doing what the hell you like. This is a huge universe where almost anything can happen, so let it. So to try and illustrate my point a little bit, and it's a little bit out there, but we sat down for whatever reason we did this, I'm not quite sure. We sat down this week with my family and we watched Miss Congeniality, which is a reasonably funny film. It has its moments. And at the time, so it's 20 years old, it's 2000, which I can't believe is actually 20 years ago. But at the time, I feel like it was a funny film and it was reasonably progressive. It showed Sandra Bullock, and she was a strong, independent woman, and it showed the people behind the... she had an opinion of the girls on the beauty pageant, but yeah, they were strong women with their own dreams and what have you, and it was kind of like about busting those caricatures, except filtered through the lens of 20 years, it's still quite sexist. And the ending of the film, where she gets together with her colleague, it's like now they would not write that like that, because it was really and it didn't really fit, and it would not be written like that now, because times have changed in the 20 years. So we go back to the 40k law, the stuff that was written 20 years ago wouldn't be written now. And so if you want to appeal to people who want to consume stuff now, you can't look back and say, well, I'm sorry, this was like this 20 years ago, it's got to be like that now. You want to be writing new things. You've got to be writing new things, otherwise people are going to look at it, like my kids to an extent, and certainly my wife and I looked at each other and kind of rolled our eyes, because it was outdated. So you don't want to be introduced, here's this brilliant new game, but all the stories are outdated. That is not what we want for our hobby. And we want to be encouraging to people to write their own stuff, because those people who write their own stuff are coming into the hobby now. Those are the people who are going to be writing the stories in 20 years, well, maybe not 20 years, 10 years time, because their passion is going to, some of them will go on to work for Games Workshop and write new stories. So we've got to allow them freedom of expression and the ability to go and write what they want to write without treading on them and squashing them. You've just got to, because they're the next generation. As I said, the 40k universe was created in response to Thatcherism, but that was 30 years ago. The worldview is different now, and it would perhaps be fitting if, because the Imperium is incredibly stagnant, it's a stagnant fascist state, it would perhaps be fitting if the law stayed static and never changed. It would sort of be vaguely ironic that we basically, in a fetishistic way, stopped the story from evolving, and we kept it exactly how it was, because that's how the Lord Emperor Jervis wanted it. But of course that isn't what he wants at all. He wants his stories to evolve, because, well, for a start, it brings people in, and because it's more interesting. The stories need to keep evolving. We need to have new ideas, fresh ideas in the hobby, and we need to allow people with different outlooks from ourselves into the hobby, because that's the way it grows. That's the way it gets better and better and better, because those new fresh ideas make us challenge about those new fresh ideas make us think about the world we live in, which is what science fiction is all about. And it makes us think about the battles we're playing and the worlds in which they're set, and they inform our opinions. And so things just need to change and evolve, and because if they do, you get brilliant stories. You start, I mean, if you read some of like H.G. Wells, obviously they're great stories for their time, but they're pretty one-dimensional, and a lot of the old science fiction is pretty one-dimensional, and we don't want that for Warhammer 40k. I have to say, I do find some of the bits of books I have read of the lore, they are quite one-dimensional, but we want to invite multi-dimensional writers like Aaron Detsky Bowden, and I know there are lots of good upcoming writers coming into the Black Library stable, but we want them to write multifaceted, different points of view stories to keep the lore going, to make the game, to inform the game informs the lore informs the game. It's a kind of cycle. We need that. We do not want a static Imperium of lore. So what do you think? Maybe I'm talking out of my bottom. Like I say, I don't know much about the lore of 40k, but I do know a lot about stories, and I do have read science fiction for years, so I have seen how the stories have evolved, and I have seen how authors like Gareth Powell, Tay Thompson, Becky Chambers have taken the genre on and made it a lot more interesting. I have to say, when I was younger, I didn't particularly like science fiction book. And I think that's because some of it's quite esoteric. Ursula Le Guin, I found she's quite cerebral, which is probably a bit much for me as a teenager. But these new writers are far more multidimensional than some of the old ones, and that's what I want to see for Black Library writing. I find some of it very, very two-dimensional. So I want to see new, varied writers bringing well-rounded characters to the 40k universe. So there you go. That is it. That's my rant, ramble, whatever. Perhaps it wasn't very coherent. It felt like a good idea tying up John Scalzi and Miss Congeniality and the 40k lore together. Perhaps it wasn't, but let me know what you think. Let me know what you think about the lore, and if you, well, I mean, I know there are people that don't want it to change. I obviously think it should, but please, comment. But do comment politely, because polite discourse is much nicer than just yelling poo at each other, isn't it? I'll be back again, I'm sure, with another ill thought out rambling in the not too distant future. But until then, everybody take care. Try not to get too hot, although I think it's going to get cooler tonight. Thank goodness. And we'll see you soon in the Beast Grave, or maybe Necromunda, or maybe Marvel Champions. We've been playing Marvel Champions recently. But anyway, do join us. Do like and subscribe if you think, wow, that guy's pretty right on. I like him. And we'll see you soon.